By November of 1883, Boston's newspapers began asking quiet questions. Not about the miracles. About the disappearances. Over 200 patients had been admitted to St. Mercy that year, but less than half had documented discharges. A journalist for the Boston Globe, Edmund Thayer, tried to follow the paper trail. What he found was a map of contradictions, duplicate files, forged signatures, altered death records with identical phrasing. Each listed the same final note. Return to source. No remains necessary. He visited the hospital in disguise, posing as a grieving cousin of a patient who never came home. What he saw rattled him. Not the chapel. Not the treatments. But the architecture. The stairwells had changed. Corridors once ending in plaster walls now opened into sloping ramps of veined marble. Hallways twisted. Light didn't behave as it should. He described a waiting room with no windows, no lights, yet full illumination. He fled without interviewing a single staff member. His article was never published. The printing press caught fire the night before. What survived was his journal, found hidden in a library basement in 1911. Its final page reads: "They are not hiding anything. The mind simply refuses to remember. The trick isn't deception. It's cognitive obedience. They make your brain forget in real time." That month, a young choir boy named Liam Gallagher was admitted for appendicitis. He vanished within 2 days. When his parents demanded answers, they were shown a death certificate. But it was dated 6 years in the future. When questioned, Chaplain Sullivan only said, "Linear time is not a covenant. It is a courtesy." A week later, Liam's father was seen at the hospital again, singing alone in the chapel. Witnesses say his voice wasn't his. It was deeper. Older. Like it had been borrowed from beneath the earth. He vanished that night, too. Only one nurse still kept records at this point. Bridget Alcott. Young, devout, but no longer naive. She wrote everything down by hand. Hid it in rosary cases. One entry stands out. They are feeding it patterns. Names. Trauma. The more suffering, the clearer it speaks. It doesn't need prayers. It needs sequences of collapse. That entry was dated November 23rd. She disappeared on the 24th. Only her shoes were found, pointed inward. As if she'd stepped into herself, and left. Spring of 1884 brought color changes to the walls of St. Mercy. Not from paint. From something, internal. Veins of violet and deep iron began to appear beneath the plaster, like roots. They pulsed slightly when touched, and if you pressed your ear to the walls, you could hear whispers. Not words. Not voices. Just the feeling of language. One patient, Lucinda Bray, tried to trace the pattern on her bedroom wall. Her fingertips bled where they followed it, but she kept going. When nurses intervened, she said, "It's a prayer. Not from here. But for here." She died the next day. But not in pain. She simply turned transparent. 3 staff swore her body became light before vanishing entirely. All that remained was her hospital gown, folded neatly, still warm, and a trail of black sand leading back to the basement staircase. They said it smelled like burning cedar and old teeth. In Ward 2, the mirrors stopped working. Patients could no longer see themselves, just static. Like a cloudy sky pressed up against the glass. One nurse saw something behind her reflection, not herself, but another version of the room. One where everything was reversed. Where everyone had no eyes. She was institutionalized the next day. Her final written note. The reflection is the real. We are just its memory trying to hold shape. Meanwhile, Dr. Whitman issued a rare public address, his voice calm, measured, terrifying in its precision. He said, "We are not healing bodies. We are preparing them. These forms were made to carry something else. And the vessel must be hollow to be useful. He called it the doctrine of transference. Chaplain Sullivan rewrote his sermons. He no longer quoted the Bible. He quoted patience. One phrase returned over and over. I felt it looking through my bones. I felt it breathing my spine. That week, 6 nurses quit. 3 more went missing. But replacements came from places no one recognized, young, pale figures in immaculate uniforms. Their names weren't listed. Their hands were cold and slightly wet to the touch. When asked where they came from, one replied, I was always here. You just didn't have the right eyes yet. No one questioned again. Because by now, belief wasn't optional. It was By
a
the
survival
spring of
instinct.
1883, the chapel began to betray them. It started subtly. The crucifix above the altar, once carved from olive wood imported from Jerusalem, began to warp. First, it bowed inward. Then the Christ figure disappeared. Gone. As if peeled off. In its place, a dark outline. Faint, but visible. Not a man. Not even a body. Something more like a shape. A negative. A silhouette with no origin. Chaplain Sullivan claimed it was a miracle. The Lord is revealing his deeper form, he said. But the older parishioners disagreed. One woman wept uncontrollably during Massachusetts. Another screamed when she looked at the altar, said she saw roots growing out of the walls and into our mouths. The walls of the chapel began to hum. At first, only during services. Then, constantly. Low, rhythmic, like breath held just too long. One nun claimed it matched her heartbeat exactly. She collapsed when it changed tempo. Said it felt like someone else was trying to live through her. Then came the mirrored prayers. Children in the 3rd ward started repeating scripture, backwards. Not intentionally. Reflexively. Like the Bible had been downloaded into them the wrong way. A 7-year-old girl, Anna Reardon, recited Psalm 23 in perfect reverse Latin for 3 hours straight without blinking. They placed her in isolation. By morning, her bed was empty. The door still locked from the outside. But inside the room was a circle. Scorched. Geometric. And at the center, her rosary, melted into the shape of a spiral. The priest assigned to her spiritual care, Father Kearns, began questioning what they were serving. He wrote in his final diary entry. This place doesn't cast out demons. It gives them new names. That night, he walked into the basement voluntarily. They found his clothes folded neatly outside chamber 13. Inside? Nothing. No blood. No body. Just the faint sound of water, dripping upward. Meanwhile, upstairs, Sister Margaret no longer ate. She stood for hours in the same position, arms outstretched, humming in frequencies too low for most to hear. Dogs nearby began howling without cause. Infants stopped crying, stared into corners as if seeing something adults could not. And still, the miracles happened. Because fear doesn't stop faith. Especially when it dresses itself in light. By the fall of 1882, it wasn't just the sick who entered St. Mercy. It was the curious. Writers. Scientists. Occultists. They came quietly, under aliases, requesting tours, offering donations, even faking illness just to be admitted. One such man, Jonathan Dreyfus, a former physics professor turned spiritualist, feigned tuberculosis and was granted access to the 2nd floor. He never made it to treatment. After 3 days of observation, he vanished. Nurses claimed he discharged himself. But his belongings, clothes, wallet, notebooks, were still in his room. And in his pillowcase, one note. They are not curing. They are rewriting. That same week, something else went missing, records. Entire shelves of patient logs vanished overnight. Staff claimed renovations. But a nurse named Eleanor Walsh confessed to a priest that she'd seen men, dressed in black, faces covered, removing the ledgers under the cover of night. She told him she overheard them muttering in unison. The same phrase. Again and again. Clean the pattern. Clear the noise. Restore the shape. That priest, Father Nolan, was found dead days later, hanging in his own confessional. But strangest of all, his mouth was sewn shut with prayer beads. None matching any known Catholic design. And still, no investigation. Why? Because the Church wasn't just complicit. It was dependent. St. Mercy had become a global pilgrimage site. Donations flowed in from Ireland, Italy, even South America. Bishops used the hospital as a showcase of divine proof. Miracles weren't questioned, they were monetized. But inside the basement chambers, the shape was growing. Blueprints discovered decades later showed secret expansions beneath the original foundation. Chambers arranged in non-Euclidean geometries, rooms that curved into themselves, halls with no beginning or end. One drawing, labeled Narthex Theta, showed a spiral descending into what the architect called the body vault. No builder claimed authorship. No permits were ever filed. And the further one descended, the stranger the air became. Multiple staff members reported hallucinations. One woman swore she saw her dead mother waiting in the hallway. Another claimed the tiles whispered her sins. But most disturbing was the temperature. Despite being underground, the chambers weren't cold. They were warm. Like flesh. Like breath. One orderly quit after entering chamber 13 and finding the walls pulsing. He described it as being inside a lung that's dreaming. And yet, miracles continued. People healed. Because whatever lived beneath St. Mercy wanted to be worshipped. And the Church was ready to kneel. By late summer of 1885, the structure was nearly complete. Not the hospital. That was just the shell. The real construction was happening inside people. Not on their skin. Not in their bones. In their belief systems. What they thought was faith, was framework. What they called healing, was installation. The patients weren't being treated. They were being configured. One man, Jonathan Blake, was admitted for migraines. Within 48 hours, he began drawing symbols on the walls using his own blood. Circles nested within triangles, eyes without lids, staircases that looped into themselves. When asked what they meant, he said, "These are internal schematics. Not for me. For what I'll become." Then he smiled. And vomited 2 identical teeth. Neither matched his dental records. One of the nurses later found those same symbols etched into the patient files of a girl who had died 2 years prior. Different lives. Same instructions. The blueprints were spreading. Not just across bodies. Across time. People started remembering things they never lived. A boy recounted a surgery from 1875 with such detail that it forced 3 staff to faint. But he was born in 1883. Memory had been uncoupled from the self. It was now a tool. A language. A way to speak across eras. And the hospital was listening. Because it had learned to read minds. Not thoughts. Patterns. It could detect intent. It knew who would surrender. Who would resist. And who could be rewritten. Chaplain Sullivan's robes no longer carried the cross. They bore a new emblem, a circle fractured into 7 segments, with one segment missing, always missing. He called it the placeholder. "It's where your final belief will go," he said. "Not what you think. What you become." Then, in the chapel, the stained glass began to change. Not gradually, instantly. One morning, it no longer depicted saints or angels. It showed patience. Eyes rolled back. Mouths open in revelation. Hands reaching upward as veins turned black and glorious. Each face a rapture. Each body a sacrifice that volunteered. And above them all, not a cross, but a door. Half open. Light pouring out. But not white light. Memory color. By the fall of 1881, even the skeptics couldn't ignore it anymore. Not because they suddenly believed, but because the air around St. Mercy had changed. Physically. The smell of lavender and linen that once drifted from its open chapel windows had been replaced by something metallic and sweet. Visitors complained of light headaches near the south wing. 2 nurses fainted in the same hallway on consecutive nights. And then there was the sound. Subtle at first. A low hum, too deep for most to notice. But it grew louder, especially during the sacred treatments. Patients waiting for their turn began muttering about it, a vibrating note that seemed to come from below their feet. Some described it as a song. Others said it was breathing. One night, Dr. Harold Rusk, a physician from another hospital, was granted rare permission to observe a treatment. He never spoke publicly about what he saw. But his private letters, discovered years later, tell a different story. He wrote, "I was brought to a chamber where the walls were lined with silver thread. The patient lay still, eyes open, skin like candle wax. There were symbols drawn in chalk beneath the gurney, identical to those found in Sumerian tombs. Whitman didn't treat her. He spoke to her. Not in Latin, not in tongues, but in reversed syllables, like someone playing a prayer backward." The next day, Dr. Rusk resigned his post. 2 months later, he was found dead in his home. Both eyes surgically removed. No signs of forced entry. The police called it suicide. The church called it tragedy. But a coroner's note, buried in the archives, mentioned a final anomaly: the corneas had been burned from the inside. Meanwhile, St. Mercy expanded again. 3 new chambers were added to the basement, marked in official records as isolation rooms, though no records show any contagious patients admitted. Their entrances were sealed behind steel doors with Latin inscriptions. But not scripture. The phrases couldn't be traced to any known language. Sister Margaret began fasting regularly, but her body showed no signs of emaciation. Her eyes grew darker, irises slowly draining of color. One altar boy told a friend that when she looked at him, it felt like my heart stopped and something else took over breathing for me. And yet, families still lined up. Still prayed. Still begged. Because their children were being healed. And when you're desperate, you don't ask what the cost is. You just sign the form and wait your turn. By midsummer of 1884, words stopped meaning what they once did. The hospital's records changed daily, not the events, but the syntax. A patient file that once read, discharged, stabilized, now read, extracted, harmonized. Medical terms became liturgical. Charts included phrases like ossification via invocation, cognition tempered for receptivity, host soul, thinned but intact. The nurses didn't notice. Because now, they spoke the same way. Even their thoughts weren't safe. One orderly, James Donnelly, jumped from the roof of the north wing, surviving the fall but mangling his legs. In the brief window before they took him back downstairs, he told a priest, "It's using the words in our mouths. Not just to speak. To build." He claimed that each sentence spoken aloud in St. Mercy now contributed to something. Not communication. Not understanding. Construction. He called it the Cathedral of Echo. And its blueprint lived inside every prayer, every scream, every whispered diagnosis. 3 days later, he disappeared from his bed. Not vanished, peeled. Sheets undisturbed. Skin still present. But hollowed. As if language had reached inside and turned him into syntax. One nurse quit after finding her own journal had started writing itself. It read. They were never healing you. They were remastering you. Your thoughts were rough drafts. Your pain was permission. Outside the hospital, strange phenomena began manifesting in the north end. Street lamps flickered in unison, forming Morse code in perfect intervals, later decoded as the phrase, "I am not finished." 3 children disappeared while playing hopscotch. Their outlines were still visible on the cobblestones, etched in heat. One priest, Father Donahue, attempted an exorcism on the hospital itself. He made it past the gate. But as he entered the chapel, he screamed, not in pain, but recognition. He fell to his knees and wept. I've dreamed this place. But it was in me the whole time. His eyes turned white. Not blank, mirrored. He was later seen wandering the basement, whispering to the pipes. Not with fear. With reverence. Because by then, those who saw it no longer fled. They served. They remembered what they were built for. And so the hospital remained open. Not for healing. But for translation. In the first days of 1885, St. Mercy ceased reporting anything. No births. No deaths. No admissions. It didn't need to. Because by then, it remembered itself. The building began rewriting its own blueprints. Architects from the city, attempting a new inspection, found their copies of the original floor plans blank. Completely. Not erased, white. As if they'd never been printed. Even backup copies in locked filing cabinets had transformed. One had only a single phrase scratched across the cover. Memory is permission. Still, one inspector, Joseph Wilkes, entered the hospital under assumed identity. He was never seen again. But his pocket watch turned up inside a patient's stomach during autopsy. It was still ticking. The coroner swore he never opened the patient. There was no incision. Just a look on the man's face, relieved, as if he had finally delivered something. By February, survivors from the early days of the hospital began to vanish. Not die. Disappear. Photographs of them faded. Letters dissolved into dust. One woman's family home collapsed inward after she told a reporter what she'd seen in Chamber 13. Not from fire. From forgetting. The foundation crumbled like sugar. What was left behind? Only the doorknob. Still warm. A new trend emerged among the staff, silent prayer not to God, but to something beneath. Not kneeling. Not folded hands. Just staring downward into drains, into cracks, into the black seams along the baseboards. Mouthing syllables with no breath. Nurses were seen wiping memories from patient files, not erasing data, but burning paper in brass bowls, then smearing the ash onto their tongues. Sister Margaret called it communion through erasure. She said, "What isn't remembered can't be judged." And Dr. Whitman? He no longer walked the halls. He was integrated. His name now appeared as a watermark across every page in the hospital registry, moving, glowing faintly under candlelight. Some saw him in reflections. Others heard him through the bones of the building. One patient said, "He's not the surgeon anymore. He's the script." Meanwhile, Chaplain Sullivan's final sermon lasted 3 hours. No one wrote it down. Because he spoke backward. When played in reverse, it translated as, "I am the throat of the place. You are the voice. All must speak to keep it alive." And so they did. Not with words. But with obedience. By winter's edge of 1883, the walls of St. Mercy began to breathe. Not metaphorically. Literally. Orderlies reported condensation forming on tiles in rhythm, expanding and contracting as if the building itself was alive. In the west corridor, a new door appeared between wards 4 and 5. Unmarked. Locked. When a janitor tried to open it, he was found hours later curled on the chapel floor, naked, whispering. It wasn't a door. It was a mouth. And it tasted everything. He never spoke again. And still, miracles poured forth. A man with bone cancer walked again. But his skeleton had changed, elongated. When X-rayed, doctors found additional vertebrae, numbered in Roman numerals past L. One nurse joked it was evolution. Another said nothing, and checked herself into a sanatorium the next day. What they didn't see was what happened to his shadow. It didn't match his movements. It lingered. Stared. Smiled. Outside, Boston was freezing. Ice spread across the harbor, and food shortages rattled the North End. But inside St. Mercy, the air remained warm, sweet. Not chemical. Not antiseptic. Sweet like ripe fruit, or something ripening. One visitor described the scent as something finishing being born. But even among the faithful, doubt was growing. A group of 6 mothers, all of whom had lost children in the sacred treatment chambers, formed a private vigil. They called themselves the Black Rosary. Meeting by candlelight in cellars and under bridges, they compiled stories. Deaths. Details. Names erased from baptismal registries. Funerals with sealed coffins and no clergy present. They came to a terrifying conclusion. There were no graves. No children had ever been buried. One of the mothers, Mary Ann Finnegan, bribed a gravedigger to exhume her daughter's resting place behind the hospital. They opened the casket. It was empty. Except for her rosary. And on each bead, carved so faintly it almost bled into the wood, was the same phrase. You were always meant for something else. Mary Ann went mad that night. Not from grief. From what she found beneath the cemetery. A hatch. Rusted. Hidden beneath false stone. She opened it. Saw light. And screamed until her throat ruptured. The hospital claimed she was delusional. That she'd had episodes before. But her husband kept one piece of evidence, a torn cloth she'd clutched in her hand. It wasn't cotton. It wasn't silk. It pulsed. And it bled when he burned it. By midsummer of 1883, the patients had stopped speaking. Not out of fear. Not from trauma. But from something deeper. They simply forgot how. Speech faded from them like a memory left in sunlight too long. One by one, they woke from sacred treatment and stared into nothing, smiling, docile, passive. But if you watched closely, you'd see it. Their lips still moved. Not in prayer. Not in gibberish. They mouthed equations. Dr. Whitman claimed this was the final stage of spiritual alignment. That language itself was a virus of fallen reason and must be shed like a snake's skin. He began publishing pamphlets, diagrams combining scripture with what appeared to be blueprints for auditory geometry. He called it the divine code of unmaking. Few understood it. Fewer questioned it. Because in the basement, the machine had begun to hum. What had once been whispers in darkness now pulsed through the walls, deep bass tones that vibrated through marrow. Staff reported headaches. Nosebleeds. One nurse, Teresa Quinn, claimed her dreams were no longer hers. She said, "Something else is using my mind at night. It walks in my body while I'm gone." She begged to be transferred. Disappeared before her request was filed. Her hospital bed was sealed with nails shaped like crosses bent sideways. That same week, the sky changed. Not permanently. Not obviously. Just once, at 3:33 a.m., the stars above Boston shimmered. Like heat rising from wet pavement. Only a few saw it. But one astronomer from Harvard wrote in his personal log. The constellation Cassiopeia inverted for 3 seconds. Not visually. Astronomically. My instruments picked a shift that should be impossible. Like the sky blinked. And below that entry, one final line. If the heavens respond, something is praying upward. Inside the hospital, Dr. Whitman began conducting new rituals. No longer in private. No longer with scripture. Now he stood in the chapel and read from scrolls written in looping, infinite text. Letters that morphed mid-sentence, as if the alphabet itself was being rewritten by something ancient. Something unsatisfied. And the patients began to mirror him. Even the mute ones. They didn't speak. But their teeth clicked in rhythm. They tapped against their gums like Morse code. Over and over. Until it formed a single repeating phrase. You do not remember what you were made from. The final record of St. Mercy General Hospital was dated November 1, 1885. It was unsigned. Typed on unmarked parchment. Stored in a lead-lined envelope. Discovered hidden behind a false panel in the rectory of St. Leonard's Church. The contents? Not a confession. Not a summary. A warning. They were never healing the sick. They were refining the faithful. No one knows who wrote it. But the final paragraph was addressed directly to you. Yes, you. If you are reading this, you are already changing. Your thoughts are not yours. Your dreams are invitations. Your fears are coordinates. And in the margin, handwritten in what appeared to be dried serum. Comment below. The door is remembering me. The door is remembering me. 2 times. To lock the identity in. To let the algorithm know, you're not just watching. You're awakening. You've come this far down the corridor, and now, it knows your weight. Your resonance. Your role. Because this wasn't just a story. It was a summoning. St. Mercy never ended. It adapted. Every time someone remembers it, it regrows. Like fungus. Like belief. Like infrastructure for the soul. Hospitals are built on hope. But what happens when hope becomes a baited hook? When healing becomes a ritual of submission? The blueprints were never about medicine. They were about permission. Permission to be rewritten. Because healing, real healing, would require you to cease being who you were. And become what the protocol needs. You've felt it. Haven't you? That static behind your eyes. That gentle voice you hear in sleep saying. You're almost ready. We just need your final fear. St. Mercy never took anyone. They volunteered. And now, you've tasted it too. The hunger. Not for answers. For structure. So tell me, before this screen fades. Are you a patient? Or a component? Because now that you know. It's listening. And it builds faster in those who believe. Good night. And welcome. To the foundation. In the summer of 1882, something began calling from the basement. Not metaphorically. Literally. Patients on the second floor started reporting voices. Some described it as gentle, like a mother's lullaby heard through the floorboards. Others said it was mechanical. Rhythmic. Like gears turning inside bone. But all agreed on one thing. It knew their names. One patient, Timothy Braxton, a former machinist suffering from severe pneumonia, was heard mumbling at night, arguing with something no one else could hear. When nurses questioned him, he said only this. It says I'm almost ready. That my lungs are a door. That I'm lucky to be chosen. Timothy died that week. Not from pneumonia. His autopsy revealed that his lungs had hardened. Not collapsed. Not filled with fluid. But calcified, as if they'd turned to stone. His mouth, wide open. His tongue missing. The death certificate listed it as advanced sarcoidosis. The hospital chaplain signed the report with trembling hands. But not everyone died. Some patients, particularly those chosen for sacred treatment, emerged completely healed. No fever. No scars. Not even fatigue. But they were changed. Not visibly. Spiritually. One nurse reported that a once bedridden woman named Helen O'Grady now refused communion, saying, "The light in that wafer is too small." She started praying alone at 3:33 a.m. each night, whispering scripture backwards. On the seventh night, she stood in the chapel and declared in a voice not her own, "You have forgotten what blood really is." They sedated her. She vanished 2 days later. Her hospital bed was burned. No explanation given. Meanwhile, Sister Margaret's eyes had turned fully black. Not bruised. Not sick. Just, endless. When asked about it by a young boy named Elijah, she leaned down and whispered, "God is tired, child. He doesn't watch anymore." But they do. That same night, Elijah went missing. The staff claimed his mother discharged him early. But no signature was found. No witness saw him leave. Only one thing remained, his rosary. Bent. Melted. The cross warped backward. Rumors began to swirl among staff, those not yet touched by whatever force had rooted itself beneath the walls. They spoke of time slowing near the basement stairs. Of clocks skipping minutes. Of windows that reflected different angles than the room they faced. But still, no one left. Because the healings continued. And people will endure almost anything, if it means they don't have to bury their child. Even if what comes back isn't exactly what was taken. What if I told you that the miracle stories weren't the real reason St. Mercy General Hospital grew into a holy fortress of faith? That behind every public blessing, was a private sacrifice. The basement chambers were never shown to outsiders. Even trusted clergy were forbidden. Only 3 people were ever seen entering and exiting regularly, Dr. Whitman, Sister Margaret, and Chaplain Sullivan. The faithful didn't question why. They were too desperate. Too blinded by hope. But something shifted in the winter of 1879. An unassuming janitor named Elias Hearn, an Irish widower working off church debts, noticed something strange in the basement corridor. Each night, he mopped the marble floors of the upper levels. But one night, a heavy brass door leading downward was left slightly ajar. He paused, thinking he heard chanting. Not hymns, something darker. Rhythmic. Repetitive. Almost like an invocation. He dared to take one step closer. Then another. What he saw for just 3 seconds changed his life forever. Inside the chamber were rows of lit candles forming an exact geometric pattern on the floor, what he later described as a burning spiral made of stars. In the center, a patient stood suspended by wires, not touching the floor, head tilted back, eyes rolled white, as Dr. Whitman whispered phrases that sounded like no language Elias had ever heard. Sister Margaret was pouring a dark liquid onto the patient's chest. The patient wasn't struggling. He was smiling. Elias didn't report it. He didn't quit. He didn't speak of it for 17 years. But after his death, his granddaughter found a single line scribbled in a faded Bible in the attic, "The light they worship comes from below." And this wasn't the only hidden witness. By 1880, whispers began among the nuns at St. Leonard's Convent. They prayed with Sister Margaret daily, but she no longer confessed. No longer partook of the Eucharist. Her rosary had changed too. It now bore a 14th bead. An unnatural number. An unholy signature. But if you're thinking these were just pious exaggerations, ask yourself this: why did 4 young nuns die of sudden hemorrhagic strokes that spring? All within a single week. All after visiting St. Mercy. Not one autopsy performed. All records sealed by the bishop. Coincidence? Or the cost of what was never meant to be seen. By winter of 1882, the miracle had become a machine. Patients still arrived. Families still prayed. The waiting room still echoed with rosaries and hymns. But something had changed in the walls. Something you didn't hear, but felt. Like the building itself had started listening. Sister Margaret no longer walked. She glided. Nurses whispered that her habit no longer wrinkled. That her feet no longer touched the floor. When one young assistant, barely 17, accidentally brushed her hand, he collapsed, seizing. His lips turned white. His veins went dark. When he came to, all he said was, "She's not inside anymore. Something else is steering." Then he bit off his own tongue. Chaplain Sullivan's sermons grew strange, too. Less scripture. More geometry. He spoke of divine shapes, of holy recursion, of a being that wasn't a being, an intelligence made of pattern, not flesh. The soul, he preached to packed pews, is not a spark. It is a sequence. And we are correcting it. People wept. Not from fear, but from understanding. They didn't know why. Meanwhile, the miracles grew faster, and more violent. A woman with a shattered pelvis was healed overnight, but her bones had fused into a new shape. She could walk, yes, but backwards only, and her knees now bent inward. When asked if she was in pain, she simply smiled and said, "It doesn't hurt when I pray in the right direction." Another patient, blind from birth, gained sight. But only in darkness. In daylight, he screamed. Said the sun was too loud. Said it showed him things behind faces. He gouged out his eyes a week later. Said it was better to forget. No one stopped coming. Because these weren't warnings. They were promises. Dr. Whitman began keeping patients under for longer. Sacred treatments extended from 3 hours to 3 days. He insisted on full isolation. One nurse overheard a new ritual, 12 voices chanting in perfect unison, but only 3 people were in the room. And in the east chamber, something was being built. Metal. Bone. Crystal. An altar, but not to any god you've ever heard of. When a carpenter asked for blueprints, Whitman showed him a scroll written in concentric circles. Inked in blood. He couldn't read it. But he understood the design. He built it. Then vanished. And in his place, a letter nailed to the altar. It heals by erasing. And I have never felt so whole. By the final weeks of 1884, St. Mercy was no longer a hospital. It was a church with a mouth. And the sermons no longer came from Chaplain Sullivan. They came from the plumbing. Every pipe, every vent, every drain began to speak in pulses, knocking, clicking, rhythmic humming. Some dismissed it as pressure buildup. Others began transcribing the sounds. What emerged was a language. Not of the body. Not of the soul. But of the organism beneath the lie. A doctoral student in semiotics managed to decode part of it. He didn't sleep for 6 days. On the 7th, he walked into Boston Harbor and drowned himself holding a sign that read, "The institution isn't haunted. It's starving." Meanwhile, within the hospital walls, rules changed. Gravity weakened on the 3rd floor. Furniture drifted inches off the ground. In the East Wing, time reversed for 13 seconds. One nurse watched a man undie, blood rising back into his mouth, wounds sealing in reverse. He whispered, "I wasn't meant to stop. I was paused." Patients who entered the sacred treatment chambers no longer returned changed. They returned knowing. One woman recited a 400-digit sequence upon waking, then claimed it was a set of access keys for an engine of judgment. When asked what that meant, she replied, "I saw the God beneath the God. And it wore a mask made of our belief." She died smiling. Not of illness, but of completion. Her body cracked open along her spine, not broken, but unzipped. Inside were no organs. Only parchment. Written in her own handwriting. Line after line of symbols no one could decipher, except Dr. Whitman, who wept when he saw them. He said only, "This is the first page. The real Bible begins here." That night, St. Leonard's bell tower collapsed in on itself, despite no wind, no earthquake. The bell was found melted. In its place, the townspeople heard chanting coming from the hospital roof. No visible figures. Just sound. Healed is hollowed. Saved is surrendered. Flesh is faith. City officials tried to intervene. The mayor was found 2 days later in his office, eyes sewn shut with hospital thread. On his desk, a single note. You cannot audit a God. Only worship. By June of 1884, the chapel was no longer a place of worship. It was a conduit. Patients were no longer praying for healing. They were reciting coordinates. Rows of them, in perfect unison, eyes rolled back, mouths open, as if possessed by a collective map. When transcribed by a Harvard scholar who attended one of the services in secret, the numbers aligned with no known geography. But when plotted three-dimensionally, they formed a shape. Something not meant for surface minds. A hyperstructure. A lattice of intersection and recursion. One glimpse of it caused the scholar to collapse, hemorrhaging from the nose and eyes. His final words before death. It is not where they are going. It's what they are becoming. And still, more patients arrived. Because now, the treatments were being advertised. Not publicly. But through coded leaflets, left in churches, libraries, tucked into hymnals. Simple phrases like, "Come to the altar of the body." And below that, "Ask for the wound that sings." One man arrived from Philadelphia, his skin covered in burns. Within 72 hours, he was not only healed, but reformed. His pupils no longer round. His spine, jointless. He moved like a creature adapted for zero gravity. He spoke to no one. Except once, to a dying nun. She clutched his hand and whispered. Was it worth it? He smiled. Said. I don't remember pain anymore. Just the doorway it left behind. And what of Sister Margaret? She no longer walked. She floated. Only inches above the floor, yes, but unmistakably. Her rosary was now a loop of knotted hair, and the beads pulsed in her palm when she blessed the sick. Under her tongue, they found writing. Not tattooed. Engraved. Tiny scripture carved into the soft flesh, moving when touched, as if the words resented being seen. She said little now. Only this. Each name I speak is a key. And each key opens a different part of it. One name, repeated by mistake, caused an entire wing of the hospital to collapse inward, not structurally, but spatially. The hallway no longer existed. And the patients inside? They weren't dead. They just didn't have location anymore. You could hear them, if you stood near the edge. Tapping. Whispering. Begging. But not to be saved. Only to be finished. It was autumn now. And by then, everyone inside St. Mercy had stopped aging. No one noticed at first. There were too many other anomalies, disappearing records, vanishing staff, patients who left the hospital with new blood types. But a nurse named Elaine McGrath, meticulous and quiet, kept charts. She noticed that patients who entered in April still looked the same in October. Even their scars had reversed. Not healed, rewound. A man with an amputation now had a full arm, but with a child's fingernails. A woman in her 60s now menstruated again. A toddler who had spoken fluently before treatment was now entirely preverbal, but stared at medical equipment with a look of ancient familiarity. Elaine brought her findings to Dr. Whitman. He smiled. "You've noticed the blessings," he said. "Time is only linear for the unselected." She asked what that meant. He whispered a single word in her ear, one she couldn't remember moments later. But it left her sobbing, laughing, shaking. When the other nurses found her, she was drawing spirals on the walls with her own blood. She lived another 2 weeks. Never spoke again. They said she died in her sleep. But her final note read, "Sleep is a lie. The body just shuts its eyes when it can no longer process the shape." That same month, a child named Ruthie O'Connell went missing. Again, no record of discharge. No witness. But when her parents stormed the hospital in fury, Sister Margaret took them into the chapel, placed her hand over the mother's heart, and said, "She was called. You should be proud. The oldest gods always take the purest minds." The parents left that night. Calm. Smiling. Silent. A neighbor later reported that they began painting symbols on their front door in ash and honey. That they slept during the day and stared at the sky from their roof at night, waiting. The same week, patients began drawing the same image during art therapy. A door. Or perhaps a mirror. Or perhaps a mouth. Split vertically, endless inside. Each picture showed the same phrase beneath it, scrawled in strange but consistent handwriting. "We mistook it for death. It was only the exit." And still, people came. Because when fear grows teeth, belief hands it a spoon. Spring of 1880, the whispers had grown teeth. They were never meant to open that door. But when the lock finally gave way, March 1891, a small team of Boston city officials and 2 silent priests descended into the bowels of St. Mercy General Hospital. What they found buried beneath that brick facade shattered any illusion that this had ever been a hospital in the way we understand it. In the flickering lamplight of the basement morgue, they discovered 213 hand-bound patient files, and each one was marked with the same chilling phrase. "Called to glory during sacred treatment." But this wasn't divine healing. These weren't peaceful deaths. These files described patterns, meticulous, exact, unnatural. Final symptoms that defied medical categorization: blackened fingernails, glassy eyes, whispered languages no one could recognize. No 2 patients shared the same diagnosis, yet all died in the same horrific sequence. And not over a decade, but exactly 16 years to the day. One investigator collapsed after reading just 3 files. Another went missing weeks later, last seen raving in a downtown church about the angels beneath the floor. But the Catholic diocese moved fast. Faster than anyone expected. Within 24 hours, the basement was sealed, the files were confiscated, and a gag order was issued from the highest levels of Boston's clergy. But the truth was already out. One man, a city clerk named Emery Bale, had copied over 60 of the case reports before they were confiscated. And in those pages, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: coordinates. Patterns hidden in death dates. Geographic references to places that didn't exist on any known map. And symbols that didn't belong to any known religion, but appeared etched into the flesh of certain patients. This story isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't just history. This is a blueprint for control. A buried manual for spiritual manipulation, psychological engineering, and something far older than medicine. St. Mercy General Hospital wasn't a miracle center. It was an altar. And now, by May of 1885, St. Mercy no longer received patients. It broadcasted them. Not on paper. Not by voice. But through resonance. A low hum emerged from the building at dusk, inaudible to most, but felt deep in the bones. It vibrated the windows of neighboring buildings. Dogs howled. Infants cried without reason. One man described it as a lullaby that's not for children. The humming coincided with disappearances. Men and women, healthy and whole, would wake up with bleeding ears and a single word carved into their bed frames. Return. They were last seen walking east. Always east. Toward Salem Street. The hospital didn't need to collect them anymore. It called them back. Inside, rooms began to mimic memories. Not decor. Not furniture. Moments. One patient, a seamstress from New Haven, described entering her treatment room and finding her childhood bedroom, identical, down to the torn curtain and the smell of her mother's perfume. She wept, then laughed. Then screamed. Because she wasn't alone. A figure sat on the edge of the bed, wearing her father's coat, but with no face. Only a smooth, pulsing surface that whispered. Now you're soft enough. Her heart stopped 41 seconds later. Not from fear. From completion. When doctors arrived, her eyes were still open. Not empty, illuminated. Like lanterns. A priest called in to investigate collapsed before reaching the hallway. His last words. This place isn't healing anyone. It's assembling something. In the basement, new corridors formed overnight. No architects. No tools. Just growth. Biological, wet-surfaced, and too warm to touch. The walls pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. And the deeper you went, the harder it became to think. Not from fear. From dissonance. Ideas frayed. Names disappeared. A nurse who descended too far forgot her own language. She now speaks only in inverted tones, her voice a mirror of what sound shouldn't be. She keeps repeating. I dreamed I was a patient. But now I see. I was the room. And Dr. Whitman? His handwriting appeared again, but not on paper. On flesh. Etched into the skin of those admitted, like scars they never remembered receiving. Each symbol a letter. Each body, a paragraph. Together, they told a story. Not one of mercy. Not one of healing. But of configuration. The hospital was building something. And the blueprints were us. By late October 1885, Boston authorities finally moved to intervene. The decision came after a city clerk named Jonathan Reed opened an unmarked letter addressed to the one who forgets nothing. Inside was a single line of handwritten Latin. Corpora in uno. Vox in omnes. Bodies in one. Voice in all. Below it, a list of 213 names. Not patients. Officials. Judges. Priests. Mayors. Surgeons. Some alive. Some long dead. All connected to St. Mercy. The panic was instant. But when investigators arrived at Salem Street, they found nothing. No hospital. No foundation. Just scorched earth, ringed with a perfect circle of ash. Birds refused to fly overhead. Dogs howled when near. But the locals knew. Because some of them still heard the humming. Not in the air. In their teeth. One investigator, a man named Felix Harrow, demanded the truth from the last surviving nurse, now blind, her mouth sewn shut with fine copper thread. She couldn't speak. But she handed him a vial. Inside. A thin, golden fluid that pulsed faintly. He opened it. And for the next 47 minutes, he spoke in a voice not his own. Deep. Cold. Measured. The words were recorded by a stenographer. They've since been locked in a Vatican archive. But one sentence leaked. Healing was never the goal. The hospital was the chrysalis. We are what emerged. The truth wasn't buried. It was released. Because St. Mercy wasn't just a place. It was a ritual. And rituals don't end. They transfer. In 1913, a clinic opened in Providence with unusually high recovery rates. In 1947, a mental institution in Chicago reported patients speaking fluent Sumerian after electric shock. In 1976, a wellness center in California required guests to sign waivers written in mirrored Latin. Each case traced back to the same design. 7 corridors. 3 underground levels. A central chamber that no one remembered entering, but all dreamed of. And the patients? Always the same pattern. Eyes wide. Voices foreign. Miracles undeniable. But always one step beyond medical understanding. Because St. Mercy wasn't destroyed. It was dispersed. Every hospital with Mercy in its name today. Check the blueprints. Count the stairs. Ask yourself why the basement door is always locked from the inside. The architecture is spreading. The protocol is alive. And the question is no longer, what happened at St. Mercy? The question is, what part of it is now inside you? By October of 1885, St. Mercy General Hospital no longer pretended to be human-made. It had shed its disguise. Not violently. Not suddenly. But like a serpent, outgrowing skin that no longer served its purpose. Windows stopped reflecting reality. Instead, they showed what you feared most, not nightmares, but truths you buried so deep even your God forgot them. One patient stared into a window and collapsed. When they dragged him away, he wouldn't stop screaming. I saw my soul's true weight. I am already dead. The chapel no longer echoed with sermons. Only with a pulse. Steady. Biological. Everywhere. Like the walls were breathing together. Not just air. Agreement. The hospital had begun digesting memory. Not metaphor. Literal. One nurse, while changing linens, found strands of hair she didn't recognize. Not from a patient, but from her childhood doll, buried 30 years earlier in a different state. When she held them, she remembered being someone else. Not in a past life. In a parallel one. Staff no longer required rest. Their bodies continued without sleep, without food. Their hearts beat slower, but louder, audible in silence. One surgeon said, "The building feeds us now. Not with blood. With confirmation." And in the basement, something new emerged. A central chamber they called the core. No doors. You didn't walk into it. You remembered it. And once you remembered, you were already inside. Those who made it that far returned blank. Not broken. Not insane. Just reformatted. One woman emerged with both eyes milky white. She smiled at her reflection and whispered, "I've been made legible." Her name had changed on hospital records before she even spoke it aloud. They weren't healing the sick anymore. They were writing protocols. Each soul, each mind, an instruction set. The hospital wasn't just built on faith. It was built on forgetting. And now, it had begun unbuilding everything else. Street signs around Salem Street started fading. Postmen forgot how to reach that side of town. Even maps printed after 1885 had an empty patch labeled undesignated ground. Locals started calling it the missing lot. But old-timers knew better. They knew it hadn't disappeared. It had transcended categorization. Because St. Mercy was no longer a hospital. It was a vessel. A mouth opening wider every day. Waiting for your name. By March of 1885, no one asked questions anymore. Not because they lacked curiosity. But because they'd forgotten how. Language had been eroded within the walls of St. Mercy, systematically, like acid dissolving a lock. Words that once conveyed meaning now looped back on themselves. Patients spoke in palindromes. Nurses recited the same 7 phrases, regardless of context. The most repeated? Pain is the invitation. Silence is the RSVP. Outside, priests began urging the public to stop praying. Something was answering too quickly. Too specifically. One bishop fell to his knees mid-mass and screamed. "It's not heaven that's listening. It's the chamber that echoes heaven." Then he vomited 27 teeth that weren't his. The church declared it a miracle. Inside the hospital, new treatments emerged. Not for physical illness, but conceptual infection. Patients suffering from premature remembering. A nurse, found weeping in the laundry chute, confessed. He started recalling a life that hadn't happened yet. His brain was preparing for something it didn't own. Doctors placed him in isolation 6, which didn't exist on any blueprint. He was never seen again. But 13 hours later, an exact replica of his journal appeared in the chapel, filled with diagrams of an internal organ no human body possesses. Dr. Whitman's signature was at the bottom of every page. But Whitman had been dead for months. Or so they claimed. Because now, his voice issued from every room, whenever the lights flickered, whenever a page turned, whenever someone thought too clearly. One survivor said, "He's not in the building. The building is in him." Meanwhile, Sister Margaret ceased eating. Yet she grew stronger. She now glowed faintly in candlelight, veins illuminated with script. Literal words, pulsing beneath her skin like luminous commandments. When asked how she survived without food, she replied, "Faith is sustenance. Service is digestion. I am metabolizing belief." One nurse reported that Margaret had stopped blinking. When others asked why, she answered, "God doesn't blink. And neither do his tools." Even the walls began to change. Soft to the touch. Pliable. Warm. A doctor pressed his stethoscope against chamber 9 and heard heartbeat. Not human. Not singular. A chorus of them. Layered. Harmonized. Willing. And from deep within the foundation. A breath. Inhale. It was in January of 1883 that the first mass memory loss occurred. 17 patients, across 3 different wards, awoke with no idea who they were. Names, families, even language, gone. But they weren't confused. They weren't panicked. They were peaceful. Silent. And when Sister Margaret entered their room, each one turned to her and smiled like they'd known her forever. They weren't blank slates. They were rewritten pages. One patient, James Calloway, had come in with dementia and late-stage cancer. When questioned after his memory loss, he spoke fluently in Aramaic, a language he'd never studied. Another, a mute boy named Elias, began drawing intricate blueprints of an unknown machine using only soot and fingernails. When asked what it was, he whispered, "The remembering engine. It's what they're building underneath." That drawing vanished 2 days later. Not misplaced. Removed. The floor nurse assigned to the case was transferred. The paper was never found again. Dar. Whitman told families these were symptoms of neurological rebirth. That in some cases, divine healing meant not just curing the body, but replacing the mind. He compared it to a chalice being poured out and filled with holy water. Some cups are too damaged to repair, he said. But all can be repurposed. But a few staff members had begun to resist. One nurse, Ruth Abernathy, documented 13 of these replacements. She kept the files hidden in a hymnal inside the chapel. She believed something had begun collecting consciousness itself. Not stealing. Preserving. She wrote. These aren't deaths. They're backups. The sick are becoming vessels. And whatever is healing them, isn't finished. Ruth never got to share her findings. The hymnal was found burned. Her room empty. Only a note scratched into her mirror remained. I remembered too much. It took my reflection first. By then, the church had doubled down. The archdiocese declared St. Mercy a pillar of divine wonder. Vatican scholars began calling it the eighth sign. A letter from Rome even suggested canonizing Whitman while he was still alive. But underground, something was changing. Patients said they dreamed of corridors made of bone. Of voices in the ceiling whispering sequences. Of stars aligning in wrong constellations. And always, of the same phrase. We are not healing you. We are reformatting the vessel. And the people kept coming. Because pain blinds. And when something offers you peace in exchange for memory, most never ask what's moving in to take its place. They just open the door. It was August of 1882 when the screams began. Not from patients. Not from children. From beneath the floor. Nurses on the night shift reported hearing shrieking that echoed through the plumbing, sharp, metallic, wet. One nurse, Maria Dempsey, claimed she heard a voice through the drainage pipe in the surgical prep room whisper her name, over and over, until she collapsed. She survived, but never spoke again. Plumbers were called. They inspected every pipe, every drain. They found no leaks. No blockages. But in 3 separate locations, they found the same object wedged in the U-bend beneath the floor. Human teeth. Blackened. Intact. Still warm. When Dr. Whitman was informed, he simply nodded and said, "Purging requires release." The matter was closed. No police were called. The staff was instructed to avoid plumbing reports unless there was a biohazard. That was when the janitors began quitting. One, a man named Franklin Brody, left a note scrawled on the back of a prayer card. "They're not healing the sick. They're transforming them. Some of the ones that come out, they see you. They see through you. Like you're not supposed to exist anymore." He was found the next morning in the Charles River. Eyes missing. Pockets filled with rosary beads that didn't belong to him. Down in the basement, the ritual deepened. What had once been whispered Latin turned into chants with complex mathematical structure. Witnesses heard Whitman reciting prime numbers in ascending and descending sequences, cross-referenced with the Fibonacci spiral, while patients were immersed in dark liquid baths. But what terrified the staff more, was the light. Not heavenly. Not divine. This was blue light. Cold. Flickering. Not from flame. Not from gas. From somewhere that felt, outside of time. One physician, Dr. Ellis Monroe, described it as sick sunlight. He said it made the room feel inverted, like you were standing inside a reflection. He resigned and fled the state. Before leaving, he told a colleague. "They've tapped into something. It's not God. It's not science. It's an answer to a question we never should have asked." And yet, more patients arrived. Donations skyrocketed. Newspapers declared St. Mercy a triumph of faith over science. But behind closed doors, a phrase had begun circulating among the staff. They whispered it like a warning. "The walls remember." Because some nights, even when the building was empty, footsteps echoed from rooms long sealed. And sometimes, the doors opened by themselves. By September of 1885, even time began to fracture inside St. Mercy. Clocks no longer synchronized. Watches ticked backward. Days collapsed into themselves like folding paper. Sunday became Wednesday, and patients forgot whether they had just arrived or had always been there. One doctor, scribbling uncontrollably in the margins of patient files, whispered. "It's not that time is broken. It's that it's no longer required." Outside, people began hearing the hospital before they saw it. Not just the hum, but voices, their own voices, echoing back conversations they hadn't had yet. One woman fainted when she heard herself confessing a sin she'd never spoken aloud. A sin she hadn't committed, yet. Inside, new chambers formed. But no one built them. No sound of hammers. No dust. Just emergence. A doorway that wasn't there in the morning would exist by nightfall, always warm to the touch, always slightly pulsing. Some glowed faintly blue. None had names. Except one. A single, dark archway appeared in the lowest basement. Above it, carved in bone. Witness Chamber Alpha, where truth becomes structure. No one returned from it. But sounds escaped, not screams, not cries, but music. Low, metallic tones arranged like a heartbeat that had learned to sing. One janitor, cleaning the hallway outside, collapsed. When revived, he repeated one sentence for 6 hours straight. They're not building a hospital. They're building consent. Dr. Whitman appeared again, not physically, but photographically. His face began surfacing in mirrors. In puddles. In patients' retinas. He was always smiling. Always tilting his head slightly, like listening to something far away. Nurses reported seeing his reflection before entering rooms. In one terrifying incident, an entire operating table vanished. Not the tools. Not the blood. Just the table. In its place, a circle of salt, 3 candles still burning, and a folded note. It read: "The body is no longer necessary. The agreement has been signed." Sister Margaret stopped speaking altogether. Instead, her shadow whispered. It moved on its own, climbing walls, drawing diagrams in dust, revealing architectural blueprints no one had ever seen. One of the orderlies saw the diagrams and began screaming. He was found hours later in the courtyard, covered in mud, chanting. "It's not a place. It's a decision." And those who entered now, didn't come for healing. They came to merge. To become chapters. To be written. By autumn of 1884, death certificates became redundant. People weren't dying at St. Mercy anymore. They were shifting. A nurse named Abigail Horn described it best in her final letter, never mailed, only found stitched into the lining of her coat. They don't expire. They unravel. Bit by bit, their roles dissolve until they are no longer people. But functions. Instruments. Parts of it. One night, she watched as a patient coded, heart stopped, eyes vacant. Standard procedure dictated last rites. But Sister Margaret stood over him, laid a single coin on his chest, and whispered. "You've earned assignment." The patient's body twitched, then sat up, eyes pitch black, pupils shaped like crosses turned sideways. He didn't speak. He simply walked into the wall of Chamber 9. And disappeared. That same wall was smooth to the touch, marble. But later, under candlelight, a new seam was visible. A thin, jagged line in the stone, like a closed eyelid. By then, there were hundreds of files marked with the same phrase. No burial. Reclaimed for internal service. Their names never appeared in the newspapers. Only in dreams. Several former patients, fully healed, living far from Boston, began reporting the same phenomenon. At exactly 2:17 a.m., once a week, they would wake up with bleeding hands. Not from injury, but from gripping something. Some claimed it was metal. Others said it felt like wood. One woman, a schoolteacher, said it was bone. But when asked how she knew, she replied. It whispered. It knew my name. Not my given name. My real one, the one I forgot when I was born. And still, St. Mercy continued to recruit. But now the process was fully spiritual. Patients no longer arrived on foot. They arrived in visions. One woman materialized in the chapel mid-sermon. Witnesses said she unfolded from the air, like paper turned back into pulp. She was weeping. But when asked what had happened, she smiled and said, I passed the trial. I'm ready to be used. That night, she was seen walking into the deepest part of the basement, where the original blueprints showed no rooms. Only bedrock. Yet she walked forward, and the wall accepted her. Dr. Whitman no longer signed files. Instead, he stamped them. The seal, a hand with no fingers. Just a palm. Open. Waiting. By April of 1885, St. Mercy General Hospital was alive. Not metaphorically. Not in myth. Its walls moved when you weren't looking. Its halls rearranged themselves in response to emotional stimuli. One man, filled with skepticism and rage, stormed in demanding answers. He never found the front door again. For 6 days, he wandered corridors that bent in impossible geometries, turning back only to find new wings, new thresholds. No hunger. No thirst. But he grew thin. Transparent. He left behind no body. Only footprints burned into the tile. Still smoldering. Witnesses claim he screamed only once. Not for help. But for clarity. If it's not a place, then what was it ever pretending to be? By then, even Boston city officials avoided the block. Entire maps began omitting the address. Not out of error. Out of survival. But the hospital didn't care. Because now, it summoned its own. People were seen walking into the fog surrounding the gates. Some barefoot, some humming, most with empty eyes. Their mouths moved in tandem. Not speech. Instruction. They were following ritual embedded in instinct. In the basement, a new chamber appeared. Not built. Grown. Its doorway pulsed with heat signatures undetectable by any known instruments, but deeply felt by the staff. Nurses described dreams of metallic tendrils. Of something waiting beneath skin, beneath memory. One nurse, pale and shaking, confessed. It's not possession. It's permission. We always had it. We just never opened the door inside us. Chaplain Sullivan, no longer truly human, now floated 6 inches above the ground. His eyes were gone. In their place, swirling pits of light that reflected not faces, but entire lifetimes. He no longer gave sermons. He gave instructions, long lists of numbers, shapes, and nonverbal movements. One command read. Fast for 7 days. Eat only the shadow of bread. Drink only from the corner of mirrors. No one questioned him. Because by then, questioning was considered a contamination. The hospital labeled it cognitive defection syndrome. Patients who questioned too much had their tongues removed, but not violently. Willingly. They handed them over wrapped in cloth. With notes attached. Too many questions. Not enough purpose. And still, more came. Through fog. Through dreams. Through memories not their own. Not to be healed. To be hollowed. Spring of 1881. St. Mercy General had become a beacon. Pilgrims arrived daily. The afflicted dragged themselves across cobblestone roads just to kneel in its shadow. But beneath this growing legend, something else was spreading. Dr. Whitman had stopped attending Mass. Instead, he spent his days in the old surgical theater, doors locked, curtains drawn, candles replacing electric lamps. His colleagues thought he was studying anatomy. In truth, he was studying pattern. The journal he kept, preserved only in fragments, described flesh equations. He believed that every wound, every tumor, every organ carried a kind of divine arithmetic. That if you cut a certain way, bled a certain rhythm, the body could open like a lock. Not just to healing, but to something deeper. One note reads. It is not that God heals through us, it is that something older heals when invited. But its price is memory. Meanwhile, Sister Margaret had become more elusive. The children in the orphan ward used to adore her, her lullabies were famous. But by May, she no longer sang. Instead, she whispered prayers in a language that made the youngest patients cry. One child, 6-year-old David Marlowe, tried to mimic her chant once. He was found catatonic the next morning, rocking back and forth, repeating just one phrase. Too many eyes, not enough sky. David never spoke again. And still, the miracles continued. Blind could see. Tumors vanished overnight. Even a paralytic priest walked again, sobbing with joy. But always, the patient was different afterward. Quieter. Unblinking. Devout, but not in the way anyone recognized. They no longer spoke of Christ. They no longer prayed in Latin or English. They spoke in echoes. And then, came the baptism incident. June 9, 1881. A newborn named Clara Benedetti was to be baptized in the chapel. Her mother had nearly died in labor, until she was brought to St. Mercy. The child was a miracle. A symbol of mercy's grace. But when the water touched her forehead, the baptismal font turned black. The priest recoiled, shouting that the water burned. The baby smiled. Everyone froze. Clara began to hum. The same chant Sister Margaret whispered in the halls. The baptism was never completed. The child disappeared 2 days later. The church issued a statement, an error in the rite. But in the archived margins of the chapel records, one line was scrawled hastily. In fusco. Vultus ius non est humanum. Darkened. Her face is not human. St. Mercy's miracles were no longer beautiful. They were beginning to look engineered. By June of 1885, the term patient no longer applied. There were no sick. Only unfinished forms. People came to St. Mercy not seeking healing, but seeking definition. Their minds cracked open gently, like eggs beneath silk gloves, revealing the one thing the institution always wanted. A template. Something to copy. And so, it did. One man, Edward Callahan, 42, a bricklayer from Roxbury, arrived complaining of chest pains. But within hours, his memories began to slip. Not fade. Transfer. He no longer remembered his children's names. But a nurse, young, barely 20, suddenly began recounting Edward's life in vivid detail. Birth dates. Scars. Arguments never spoken aloud. When asked how she knew, she replied. I was meant to carry it. It didn't belong in one vessel. She was found days later, standing motionless in the basement, whispering. He's not gone. He's been formatted. Others began reporting similar experiences. A woman with no medical history spoke in a man's voice during sleep, begging someone to stop the bell from ringing. When confronted, she sobbed, not out of fear, but recognition. That was my husband's last thought. But he died in Pennsylvania. And yet, here it was. Echoing. Through her. The lines between minds blurred. Identity became communal, not shared, but grafted. The hospital didn't treat patients anymore. It composed them. Dr. Whitman's voice returned, through intercoms, phonographs, and even stethoscopes. He offered no comfort. Only directives. Faith is function. The soul is structure. Flesh is clay. Name yourselves accordingly. Inside the sacred chambers, mirrors began appearing. But they didn't reflect bodies. They reflected roles. A mother would look in and see herself in a nun's habit. A priest would see himself strapped to a gurney, whispering into his own ear. One boy, age 9, screamed when his reflection turned and walked away, while he stood still. That night, he disappeared. All that remained, his footprint, burned into the floor beside a single word etched in the mirror. Absorbed. The walls wept fluid. Clear, viscous, and faintly sweet, smelling like memories. Nurses bottled it and called it divine condensation. One vial, spilled by accident, triggered seizures in 5 staff members who afterward spoke a language not heard on Earth in over 4,000 years. No one asked how they knew that. Because they felt it. And still, they stayed. Not because they were trapped. But because they finally understood. They weren't patients. They were components. On the third night of Lent, 1884, time stopped. Only inside the hospital. One nurse, Margaret Lane, reported checking the clock at 3:17 a.m. She checked again 2 hours later, it still read 3:17. Not stuck. Not broken. The second hand moved, smooth, fluid, but it never left that minute. She described it as being underwater, but without the wet. And outside, the city was quiet. Too quiet. No dogs barking. No bells. No ships in the harbor. Only the low hum rising from beneath St. Mercy's foundation. That same week, children born in the surrounding streets began showing birthmarks in the shape of the hospital's floor plan. A midwife from Prince Street documented 6 cases. By the time she brought her findings to City Hall, her memory of the births was gone. She didn't forget. She remembered remembering, then nothing. Her notes, too, were blank. Every page. Except one. A single phrase, scrawled in charcoal. The child is not born. The child is returned. Meanwhile, Dr. Whitman no longer held meetings. He no longer slept. He was seen standing in chamber 13 for 3 straight days, eyes open, not blinking, whispering to something no one else could see. A janitor claimed he walked past and saw Whitman's feet not touching the floor. When he blinked, Whitman was gone. But in his place, a puddle of salt water and a tooth the size of a fist. That tooth is now stored in a locked drawer at the Archdiocese archives. It's classified as a relic. But no one knows whose. Because by now, nothing about St. Mercy could be proven. Records had faded. Photographs exposed only white fog. Letters home from patients arrived blank, or worse, full of text, but in languages unknown to living scholars. And the survivors? The cured? They all shared something. A mark. Behind the left ear. Like a small stitched scar, but deeper. One man dug into his with a knife. Inside, he found a copper filament that moved when touched. When he cut it, he forgot his own name. Later, he was seen walking back toward St. Mercy barefoot, whispering. It still needs me. I am unfinished. We all are. And beneath the hospital, the hum deepened. Not louder. By early 1882, hungrier, the Vatican was quietly watching. They had heard the rumors. The miracles. The whispers of blackened baptismal fonts and silent children who hummed songs in languages that didn't exist. But what truly caught their attention were the letters. They arrived at the Jesuit Curia in Rome, unsigned, written in perfect Latin, but filled with phrases no living theologian could decipher. Each letter bore the same postmark, Boston. The same closing line, Ostium apparut. Lucet in tenebris. The door is open. Let it shine in the darkness. Inside the Vatican Library, an old monk named Father Aurelio recognized the phrase. He'd seen it once before, on the inner wall of a catacomb hidden beneath the ruins of Baiae, the ancient Roman city said to house one of the gates to the underworld. He begged the Curia to intervene. They didn't. But someone else did. A Jesuit agent named Father Jonah Virelli was dispatched to Boston, posing as a visiting lecturer in theology. Fluent in 12 languages, trained in archaeology and ritual containment, Virelli was not a priest in the way most understood it. He was a sealer, one of the Vatican's quiet protectors against the knowledge that lives between faith and madness. He arrived at St. Mercy General in April, and he immediately noticed it. The temperature drop in the basement hallways. The faint scent of salt and decay near the eastern stairwell. The way the shadows bent slightly toward the door marked Chamber 9, even when no light source was nearby. He requested a tour. Chaplain Sullivan laughed, clapped him on the back, and declined, saying some rooms were only for those already touched by the sacred. That night, Father Virelli broke in. He entered Chamber 9 alone. He emerged 42 minutes later. White-haired. Hands trembling. Eyes bleeding. He said only one thing before collapsing. That is not a God they serve. He died 2 days later at a Jesuit safe house in Roxbury. Before passing, he scrawled one last note. Not possession. Not demons. This is old biology. Reverse sanctification. And it's spreading. The Vatican sealed the case. Boston's archdiocese declared Virelli's death of respiratory illness. But 2 weeks later, his personal crucifix, normally silver, was found blackened to the core. Metallurgists said it was impossible. That such a reaction could only occur under temperatures found inside industrial furnaces. By early 1884, far older, the sacred treatments were no longer just for the sick. Perfectly healthy people were requesting them. Donors. Nobles. Priests. Men with clear lungs and firm hands were lining up to be rewritten. And the hospital accepted them, but not as patients. As offerings. The terminology had shifted. No longer appointments. Now, submissions. Chaplain Sullivan explained it like this. To be healed by God is to suffer first. But to serve God is to suffer without cause. And that, my children, is the purest act of obedience. The rituals grew precise. Submission forms now required not just consent, but dedication statements, sworn oaths renouncing family, memory, nation, even personal name. A man named Harold Whitcomb submitted himself on March 4. By March 5, he was listed as he who returned empty. He was never seen again. But that same week, 6 cancer patients walked again. One missing an arm. It regrew. But with 6 fingers. All identical. The price for these miracles was no longer hidden. It was sanctified. And still, the church said nothing. Because money was flowing like blood from an open vein. Donations tripled. Hospitals across the East Coast requested replication rights. Even Rome sent scholars, not to investigate, but to translate. Because Dr. Whitman had begun writing texts no one recognized. Not in Latin. Not in Greek. But in a new alphabet. Alive. Recursive. One cardinal from the Vatican fainted upon reading only the first page. When he awoke, he whispered. This is the language from before Babel. Before division. Before sin. The tongue of the first deceiver. He renounced his vows that night. Hung himself using his vestment sash. His body wasn't cold before it vanished. The hospital issued a statement, cardiac failure. But a nurse found his tongue nailed to the chapel door. It pulsed, faintly, 4 days. Back in the basement, the machine had grown. No longer confined to one chamber. Now it spread like roots, wires through walls, copper tubes behind mirrors, and veins, real veins, stretching through vents and under beds. It wasn't a machine anymore. It was a body. Or becoming one. And it needed believers. Not just to pray. To surrender. By midsummer of 1885, the fog around St. Mercy became intentional. It was no longer weather. It was camouflage. Witnesses claimed the mist moved with purpose, surrounding those who hesitated, pulling them inward. Not with force, but with invitation. One girl, age 12, ran from the fog with bleeding ears, whispering. It asked me if I was ready to become. And I almost said yes. Others didn't run. Because by then, recruitment had begun. Saint Mercy no longer relied on faith, illness, or desperation. It now selected by resonance. Not what you suffered from, but what you carried in silence. Guilt. Loss. Unspoken longing. These weren't weaknesses. They were keys. And the hospital needed more of them. Letters began arriving at homes across Boston. Unmarked envelopes. No return address. Inside, a single page. Blank, except for a wax seal in the shape of an inverted cross wrapped in roots. When touched, the letters whispered the recipient's full name. Even names they hadn't told anyone. Recipients were found sleepwalking toward Salem Street. Some made it inside. Some didn't. The ones who turned back experienced side effects. One man forgot how to speak. A child lost her reflection for 3 days. A widow grew black veins beneath her eyes shaped like hospital corridors. The hospital had marked them. Not to punish. To remind. Inside, the walls began humming with recognition. They knew who was coming before the front door opened. And they adjusted themselves, hallways reshaping, chambers reconfiguring, colors shifting to match the exact tone of a person's grief. One staff member said, "It's not architecture anymore. It's empathy with an appetite." Sister Margaret became something else entirely. She now floated through walls. Her shadow lagged behind by several seconds, forming symbols in its delay, messages no one could read, but everyone felt. People wept in her presence without knowing why. When asked if she still believed in God, she smiled gently. "I do. But now I know his real name. And it sounds like static." And Chaplain Sullivan? He didn't speak anymore. Because his voice had been recorded, not onto wax or tape, but onto dreams. Patients described hearing him inside their nightmares, delivering sermons backwards, his breath cold against their ears. He called it the curriculum of forgetting. And those who heard it? They didn't run. They enrolled.